Please close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the very specific crunch of a warm, dark bread crust, or the thick, fragrant smell of unrefined sunflower oil filling the small kitchen of your childhood. Do you remember how it felt? Today we are going to take a journey back to a time when life was much simpler, a time when our pockets might have been empty, but our hearts were absolutely full. We are going back to the 1970s and 80s in Russia, to remember 20 simple, wonderful foods we ate when we had no money. These were the everyday treats that made us incredibly happy, long before fancy supermarkets and imported sweets existed. Settle in, get comfortable, and listen closely, because waiting for you at the very end of this list is the most magical, absolutely free treat of all, a memory that will surely bring a tear of warm nostalgia to your eyes. Before we begin our list, let us remember how differently time flowed back then. The days felt longer, the seasons felt richer, and there was absolutely no rush. Waiting in line for fresh bread was not an annoyance, it was a daily social event where news was shared and friendships were maintained. Today there is a strange myth that because we lacked modern technology and endless entertainment, we somehow lived a poorer life. But you and I know the truth. We know that our lives were wonderfully rich in genuine human connection and sincere emotions. We did not stare at screens, we looked each other in the eyes. We shared our toys, we shared our secrets, and most importantly, we shared our food. Every simple snack was an excuse to gather in the courtyard, to sit on a wooden bench, and to simply be together. It was a time when the smallest things, like a piece of sugar or a handful of berries, could bring an immense amount of joy. We were rich in the ways that truly mattered. Let us begin with a true masterpiece of absolute simplicity, a treat that tasted better than any modern pastry. Picture a thick, generous slice of fresh black bread, the kind that was still warm when you bought it from the local bakery. You would hold it in your hand, feeling its comforting weight and the rough, floury texture of the crust. Then you would pour a little pool of unrefined, fragrant sunflower oil right in the center. The oil was dark gold, smelling intensely of roasted seeds, completely unlike the clear, tasteless oils we have today. To finish this creation, you took a pinch of coarse, gray salt and sprinkled it over the oily surface. The loud crunch of the salt crystals against your teeth, blending with the dense, slightly sour taste of the rye bread and the rich aroma of the sunflower oil, created an absolute explosion of flavor. You would run out into the courtyard with this precious slice in your hand, gladly sharing a bite with your best friend. It was messy. The oil would inevitably run down your chin and stain your fingers, but you did not care at all. This simple combination was the ultimate childhood fuel. Now let us move to another beloved creation, a true symbol of resourcefulness that served as the ultimate dessert for any child of the 1970s. Imagine a thick slice of a fresh white loaf, the kind that was so soft it practically melted in your hands. You would take a knife and carefully spread a generous layer of real creamy butter over the surface. The butter had to be slightly softened, just enough to catch and hold the precious topping. Then came the magic touch. You would take a spoonful of white granulated sugar and sprinkle it evenly over the butter. The moment you took a bite, you experienced a wonderful symphony of textures. You felt the soft, pillowy bread, the rich and smooth butter, and the loud, satisfying crunch of the sugar crystals against your teeth. As you ran outside to play hide and seek with the neighborhood kids, the tiny sugar crystals would inevitably fall onto your shirt and chin, leaving a sticky, sweet trail. We did not have fancy frosted cupcakes or expensive imported chocolates, but we had this. It was a completely homemade cake, assembled in seconds, yet it brought us profound joy. When autumn arrived, bringing the crisp, cool air and the smell of fallen leaves, there was one outdoor ritual we all loved. Do you remember the magic of baked potatoes cooked directly in the campfire ashes? We would gather dry branches and yellow leaves, building a small fire right in the yard or near the forest edge. Once the flames died down, leaving a bed of glowing grey embers, we would toss in raw, unpeeled potatoes. Waiting for them to cook required immense patience. Finally, using a long stick, we would roll the charred black lumps out of the fire. They were always too hot to hold, so we tossed them rapidly from hand to hand, laughing at the burning sensation. Breaking the potato open revealed a steaming, snow-white, powdery interior that contrasted perfectly with the blackened skin. We ate them without forks, burning our fingers and lips, getting charcoal all over our faces. The taste of the sweet, starchy potato mixed with the bitter, smoky ash was simply divine. It was the taste of autumn, of freedom, and of wild childhood adventures that cost absolutely nothing, but gave us everything. If we desperately wanted a piece of candy, and the cupboards were empty, we became little alchemists in our own kitchens. The ritual of melting sugar on a heavy metal spoon is something every child from our generation remembers vividly. You would take a large tablespoon, fill it with ordinary granulated sugar, add just a tiny drop of water, and hold it carefully over the blue flame of the gas stove. You had to hold your breath and watch closely as the white crystals began to bubble, slowly turning into a rich, dark amber liquid. The smell of caramelizing sugar would instantly fill the entire apartment. If you were fancy, you might pour the liquid onto a buttered plate or stick a matchstick into it to make a proper lollipop. But usually, we just let it cool slightly on the spoon and licked it, inevitably burning our tongues in our absolute impatience. It was a dangerous, sticky, and wildly exciting process. That homemade caramel, tasting slightly burnt and intensely sweet, was a triumph of our imagination over the scarcity of the era. Another bizarre but universally loved treat was the dry fruit kisel briquette. Our mothers would buy these dense, pink, rectangular blocks from the grocery store with the intention of boiling them into a thick, warm fruit drink. But we children had very different plans. We could never wait for the water to boil. Instead, we would sneak a briquette from the pantry, peel back the paper wrapper, and simply gnaw on it like a brick of sweet, fruity chalk. It was incredibly hard, requiring strong teeth to break off a piece, and it would leave our lips and tongues stained bright pink. The flavor was intensely concentrated, a sharp burst of artificial cherry or strawberry that made our mouths water. Sharing a block of dry kisel with a friend while sitting on a staircase was a secret rebellion against the rules of cooking. It was crunchy, dusty, and overwhelmingly sweet. Even today, just thinking about that distinct, powdery texture brings back a rush of memories from those long, unsupervised afternoons when the world belonged entirely to us. Do you remember the legendary crust of bread wrapped with garlic? We called it the gorbushka. The ritual always began on the way home from the bakery. The warm, fragrant loaf was simply too tempting to resist, and by the time you reached your door, the crunchy corner was always mysteriously bitten off. But the real magic happened in the kitchen. You would take that remaining crust, grab a fresh, peeled clove of garlic, and rub it vigorously against the rough surface of the bread. The crust acted like a natural grater, catching the sharp, pungent oils of the garlic. Then you dipped the bread into a small pile of coarse salt. The result was a fiercely spicy, incredibly aromatic snack that made your eyes water and your breath smell for the rest of the day. Our mothers always told us that this was the absolute best medicine against winter colds, and we believed them. Eating that garlic bread was a badge of honor, a fiery, savory delight that warmed you from the inside out and perfectly satisfied the deepest afternoon hunger. Let us talk about a street food that was also a profound social activity. Roasted sunflower seeds, wrapped in a simple newspaper cone. We bought them from the elderly babushkas who sat near the bus stops or the local markets. They measured the shiny black seeds using small glass cups. For just a few coins, you received a warm, fragrant cone expertly folded from yesterday's edition of the Pravda newspaper. The smell of freshly roasted seeds, slightly oily and salty, was absolutely intoxicating. But eating them was an art form. You sat on a wooden bench with your friends, rhythmically cracking the shells with your front teeth, extracting the tiny sweet seed and spitting out the shell. It was a meditative, continuous motion. Your fingers would turn dark from the black dust of the shells, and your lips would get slightly salty. The seeds were never the main point. They were simply an excuse to sit together for hours, talking about our dreams, gossiping about school, and watching the evening slowly descend upon our quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Sometimes, the greatest treats were the byproducts of our mother's cooking. Whenever a large head of cabbage was being chopped for the Sunday borscht or for winter fermentation, We children would hover around the kitchen table like little hawks. We were waiting patiently for the ultimate prize, the cabbage stalk. Once all the leaves were removed, our mother would slice the thick, dense, white core and hand it to us. It was incredibly hard, requiring a loud, satisfying crunch with every single bite. The taste was surprisingly sweet, slightly peppery, and wonderfully juicy. In a time when exotic fruits were the stuff of fairy tales, that humble cabbage stalk was our local apple. It was refreshing, clean, and completely free. We would sit under the kitchen table, gnawing on the white core, listening to the rhythmic sound of our mother's knife chopping the rest of the vegetables. That simple piece of the vegetable, usually discarded by modern cooks, held the pure, innocent sweetness of our happy, uncomplicated childhood. Summer brought its own wild delights, mostly found by climbing fences and exploring the neighborhood orchards. The thrill of finding unripe, bright green apples or small, sour plums was unparalleled. We never waited for the fruit to actually ripen. We wanted it green, hard, and fiercely sour. We would stuff our pockets with a stolen treasure and retreat to our secret hiding spots. The first bite into a green apple would make your face scrunch up, your eyes water, and your jaw ache from the intense acidity. To combat the sourness, we would bring a matchbox filled with ordinary salt from home, dipping the wet, bitten apple directly into the salt. It was a shocking combination of sour, salty, and bitter that we absolutely adored. Eating those unripe fruits was an act of bravery, a test of endurance among friends. Despite the inevitable stomachaches that our grandmothers always warned us about, we never stopped hunting for those incredibly sour, wonderfully forbidden green treasures. There was one treat that required nerves of steel and hours of absolute patience: the legendary boiled condensed milk. Making it was a high-stakes kitchen adventure. We would take a tin can of sweet condensed milk, place it in a large pot of water, and boil it on the stove for 3 long hours. You had to constantly check the water level because if the water boiled away, the tin can would explode, painting the kitchen ceiling with sticky, boiling sugar. The anticipation was agonizing. When the time finally passed, we waited for the can to cool down before piercing the metal lid. Inside, the pale, runny milk had magically transformed into a thick, dark brown, incredibly dense caramel. We did not spread it on bread or use it in cakes. We ate it straight from the jagged can using a small teaspoon. The sweet, creamy, roasted flavor was richer than any chocolate. We would scrape the sides and the bottom of the can until the metal shone perfectly clean, savoring every tiny drop of that hard-earned, dangerously delicious homemade caramel. A trip to the local pharmacy sometimes resulted in a very special kind of treat, one that looked like chocolate but tasted entirely unique. Do you remember the dense, dark rectangles of hematogen? It was technically a medicinal supplement meant to boost iron, but to us it was a rare and precious sweet. Whenever we were given a few small coins for returning empty glass milk bottles, we would run to the pharmacy and ask for a bar. It had a distinctly heavy, chewy texture, slightly grainy, with a deep, sweet and faintly metallic flavor that we somehow completely loved. It did not melt in your hands like real chocolate. You had to bite into it with effort. Because it was sold at the pharmacy, eating it felt somewhat official, a healthy indulgence that our parents actually approved of. We would break off the small rectangular segments and let them slowly dissolve in our mouths. That sweet blood bar, wrapped in its simple paper packaging, remains one of the most uniquely nostalgic flavors of our entire generation. When the scorching heat of July finally arrived, salvation came in the form of a massive yellow barrow towed by a tractor to the corner of the street. It was the legendary street kvass. The moment the barrel appeared, a long line of neighbors with varied jars and cans would instantly form. But if you just wanted a quick drink, you bought a mug on the spot. The seller, usually a stern woman in a white apron, would take a heavy, thick glass mug, press it upside down on a small metal fountain to rinse it, and then fill it from the barrel's tap. The dark, frothy liquid poured out, smelling powerfully of fermented rye bread and sweet raisins. You drank it right there on the street, feeling the icy, bubbly liquid wash away the summer heat. The kvass was wonderfully sharp, slightly sour, and deeply refreshing. Sharing that single glass mug with the entire neighborhood, without a single thought about germs, was a testament to the absolute trust and communal spirit of the time. It was not just a drink, it was the ultimate taste of the Soviet summer. In our homes, absolute respect for bread was a strict rule. Throwing away a stale loaf was considered a terrible sin. Instead, our mothers and grandmothers turned old bread into a magical snack. They would cut the dry white or black bread into small cubes, spread them out on a sheet of newspaper, and place them directly on the hot cast iron winter radiators, or slowly dry them in the oven. The whole apartment would fill with the cozy, toasted smell of drying bread. These homemade croutons became our equivalent of modern potato chips. We would grab a handful and eat them while reading a thick library book or watching a rare cartoon on the black and white television. They were incredibly hard, requiring you to soften them slightly in your mouth before chewing. Sometimes we rubbed them with a little garlic or sprinkled them with salt, but mostly we just enjoyed the simple, comforting crunch of plain, toasted bread. It taught us the beautiful lesson that absolutely nothing should ever be wasted. The ritual of drinking tea was also beautifully unique, especially when we practiced the art of drinking it through a piece of sugar. We drank strong, dark Indian tea, often brewed from a cardboard box adorned with a picture of a walking elephant. The tea was poured hot and completely unsweetened into a porcelain cup with a saucer. Instead of stirring sugar into the cup, we used hard, crystalline lumps of lump sugar. You would take a rough, white cube, place it securely between your front teeth, and take a slow sip of the scalding, bitter tea directly through the sugar. The hot liquid would instantly begin to melt the sugar cube, creating a sudden, intense rush of sweetness that perfectly balanced the strong, dark tea. You had to time it perfectly, finishing the sip before the sugar completely dissolved and collapsed on your tongue. It was a cozy, comforting evening ritual, usually performed while sitting around the kitchen table, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the quiet, soothing conversation of our parents. For special occasions, when we craved a fancy cake but baking one was too expensive or complicated, our mothers created the famous potato cake out of simple leftovers. They would take plain, dry biscuits that had lost their crunch and crush them into a fine, sweet sand. This powder was then mixed with a little softened butter, a generous spoonful of dark cocoa powder, and whatever condensed milk was left in the fridge. We loved helping to roll this dark, sticky mixture into small, oval shapes that perfectly resembled unpeeled potatoes. Sometimes they were dusted with a little more cocoa or decorated with tiny drops of butter to look like potato sprouts. After a few agonizing hours chilling in the cold refrigerator, they transformed into incredibly dense, rich, chocolatey truffles. Biting into that cold, heavy cake brought a wave of intense, satisfying sweetness. It was a brilliant, magical transformation of stale cookies into a premium dessert, proving once again that true culinary genius is born entirely out of humble necessity. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, the grocery store suddenly featured rows of massive 3-liter glass jars filled with a perfectly clear liquid. It was birch sap. Sometimes we would go into the forest ourselves, making a small cut in the white bark of a birch tree and hanging a glass jar to catch the slow, steady drip of the sap overnight. The taste of birch sap is incredibly difficult to describe to someone who has never tried it. It was not intensely sweet, nor was it particularly fruity. It tasted exactly like melting snow, like the fresh bark of a tree, and like the very essence of spring itself. It was a subtle, watery sweetness that felt wonderfully pure and incredibly healthy. Carrying that heavy, dusty 3-liter jar home in a string bag, pouring the clear liquid into a faceted glass, and drinking it down in one long gulp was a refreshing ritual that signaled the end of the long, dark winter and the joyful arrival of the warm, sunny days. No list of our childhood foods would be complete without mentioning the absolute perfection of the doctor's sausage sandwich. This was not just a piece of food, it was a carefully constructed delicacy. You started with a thin, soft slice of white bread, and you placed upon it a very thick, generous wheel of pale pink, incredibly fragrant doctor's sausage. But the true secret, famously taught to us by a clever cartoon cat, was in how you ate it. You had to flip the sandwich upside down. You placed the cold, smooth meat directly onto your tongue, letting the delicate, slightly garlicky flavor of the sausage hit your taste buds first, while the soft bread rested against the roof of your mouth. The texture of that real Soviet kolbasa was perfectly uniform, tender, and intensely savory. Eating the sandwich with a cup of sweet tea was the ultimate after-school snack. A moment of pure, uninterrupted gastronomic bliss that we always look forward to after a long day of mathematics and literature classes. Even the most ordinary leftover dinner could be turned into a masterpiece. Picture a bowl of yesterday's plain, boiled macaroni sitting cold in the refrigerator. Instead of eating it sad and cold, we threw it into a heavy, black cast-iron skillet with a generous lump of butter. We fried those plain noodles over high heat until the edges turned wonderfully golden brown and incredibly crispy. The sound of the sizzling butter and the smell of toasted pasta filling the kitchen was absolutely magnificent. Sometimes, if we wanted a sweet dinner, we would sprinkle white sugar over the frying noodles, creating a strange but delicious crispy caramelized pasta dish. The contrast between the soft, chewy inside of the macaroni and the loud, buttery crunch of the fried edges was totally irresistible. It was a magical, comforting meal born from absolute leftovers, cooked in a heavy pan that had fed our families for generations, proving that a little butter and heat could fix absolutely anything. During the long freezing winters, nature provided us with the ultimate free treat, much to the absolute horror of our anxious mothers. We are talking, of course, about eating snow and icicles. When the thick layer of snow was fresh and perfectly white, we would scoop it up with our woolen mittens and eat it right there in the yard. But the grand prize was always a perfectly clear, long icicle hanging dangerously from the edge of a low roof. We would snap it off with a satisfying crack, holding the freezing crystal in our hands. We sucked on those icicles exactly as if they were expensive lollipops. They tasted brilliantly pure, like winter frost and cold metal. Our mothers would yell from the windows, warning us of terrible sore throats and fevers, but we never listened. The sheer joy of consuming a piece of the frozen winter landscape, feeling our lips go completely numb and our teeth ache from the cold, was a rebellious, exhilarating childhood pleasure that cost 0 kopecks. And finally, we arrive at the most magical, the most ancient, and the most absolutely free treat of our entire childhood. Do you remember chewing the resin from the cherry trees? In the heat of the summer, we would search the trunks of the fruit trees in the yard or the village for those hard, amber-colored drops of dried tree sap. We picked them off with dirty fingernails and popped them straight into our mouths. At first, it was brittle and bitter, tasting strongly of wood and bark. But as you chewed it patiently, it magically transformed into a sticky, dense, natural chewing gum. It had no sugar, no artificial flavors, just the pure, earthy essence of the tree. Chewing that resin while sitting high up on a thick tree branch, looking down at the world, gave us an incredible sense of freedom. It was a secret gift from nature, a treasure hidden in plain sight. That simple bitter taste is the true flavor of our untamed, beautifully wild childhood. A time when the whole world was ours to discover. When we look back at these 20 memories, a beautiful truth reveals itself. We do not actually miss the stale bread, the sour green apples, or the bitter tree resin. What we deeply, truly miss is our youth. We miss the incredible feeling of time moving slowly, the absolute safety of our courtyards, and the remarkable ability to find pure, unadulterated happiness in a simple piece of sugar on a spoon. We were not poor, we were emotionally wealthy beyond measure, deeply connected to our friends, our families, and the simple magic of everyday life. If this journey back in time brought a warm smile to your face or a nostalgic tear to your eye, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing these beautiful memories together. And now I want to ask you, what was your favorite childhood treat that cost absolutely nothing? Did you have a special ritual with bread or perhaps a secret recipe made from leftovers? Please share your personal stories in the comments below. Let us read them and remember those wonderful golden days together.